Gray Cook introduced me to this term, God, 20 years ago. It stuck with me, this concept of a non-failure threshold. What's the level you need to be at where you're not going to fail? So his example was, hey, show up to the combine, you put 50 linebackers in the room. I can't tell you who's going to be the next all-pro, but I can probably tell you the 5 or 6 that aren't going to make it just based on even testing or watching them go through those things. Maybe we flip the script that way and say, hey, I'm not trying to create the next best all-star. I'm trying to create a program where I am going to elevate that bottom quartile up a little bit, and let's go from there.
Team, welcome back to another week here at the Mops and Mo's podcast street. I don't
Street?
know.
What are you talking about?
Another week at the Mops and Mo's podcast emporium. Drew and Alex here.
Drew's trying something new. I don't know what this
I don't
is.
know. It's off. This is ad-libbed. You did something fun today.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't actually know if she listens to the podcast or not, but thanks, Erin.
Thanks, Aaron.
One of my friends had her last flight as an Army Black Hawk pilot. Got to fly around the mountains in a helicopter. Pretty fun.
Do they get to do any trick? Can you do tricks in a Black Hawk? That's probably dumb.
I mean, I don't know what the definition of tricks is. There was some pretty cool nap of the earth flying through ravines and stuff like that, flying really low along the water. We went right over some whitewater rafters, and we were only 30 to 50 feet above them.
Rapids?
Rafters, people in rafts were 30 feet below us.
Dude, they're probably freaking out.
So that was pretty sweet. The aviation lifestyle seems pretty cool. I did all my active duty time in pretty normal Army units, infantry battalion, engineer battalion, stuff like that. And in those units, you just kind of go camp in the woods for weeks at a time. Turns out if you're an aviator, you just fly to cool private airports, grab lunch, and fly back.
My grandfather was a fighter pilot in Vietnam, and he was stationed actually at Fort Polk, I think, for a little bit. They would fly up to Maine and get fresh lobster and fly back because you have to accumulate hours. I don't think you could do that. I think we talked to General Drowley about this.
Probably. I know on the Air Force side, because there's Space A travel, and they're big planes doing rotators to get people out to remote bases and things like that. And I've noticed, and this is purely anecdotal, I don't have any research or data to back this up, but weirdly, those rotator planes never seem to break down in crappy places. No, but they always seem to break down and get the pilots stuck, heavy air quotes there, on beautiful Pacific islands and stuff.
I'm telling, I maintain, people might disagree with this. Okay, if we say that we're in a peacetime military right now, ish, I think being a fighter pilot is probably the best job you can have. Because if we're all just going to be playing pretend, I'd rather play pretend in an F-35 than, to your point, go
they're
camping.
Getting air-to-air kills again.
I saw that. What did they shoot down?
Drones.
Oh.
Yeah, it doesn't feel as cool.
It doesn't feel nearly as cool.
But they're the Navy ship that was doing all that stuff came back, and
seems like a waiting lobby training mission for.
Well, they put a bunch of kill graphics on their ship of the different kinds of drones they shot out of the sky, and they're doing the same thing on fighters that shoot down drones. You got to get what you can get, I guess. But
that dude got a kill for the weather balloon or whatever Chinese thing. So,
do you know if he put a balloon icon on his?
I think
aircraft?
He did.
That's
Didn't
awesome.
they? I think they did.
I think so. I think I remember seeing a picture.
Man, Eddie Rickenbacker's probably rolling over in his grave right now. Sons of bitches. We were shooting each other with revolvers. You guys are knocking down remote controls. Anyway, this has absolutely nothing to do with who we're talking to.
Entirely unrelated.
I don't even think we talked about playing. We didn't. But we're talking to, who are we talking to?
Oh, we're talking to Chris Frankel. Chris is a extremely overdue guest on the pod.
I thought you were about to say overweight, and that would have been.
He's extremely fit. We'll talk about that too. But I think this might be in the outro, but I'm pretty sure I've been trying to get Chris to come on for 7 or 8 months here or something like that. Had travel conflicts and life conflicts, and I think we can blame the last cancellation on Drew's sick child. All valid excuses, but it took us a long time to make this episode actually happen. But we finally got him on. Chris is awesome. So Chris Frankel, over 40 years of experience, including significant contributions to fitness, sports performance, and tactical training through his roles in academia, coaching, and instructor development. Dr. Frankel earned his doctorate in health, exercise, and sports science from the University of New Mexico and has developed and delivered evidence-based fitness education worldwide. He is a self-described gym rat and science geek. And to use his words, he's currently fighting the good fight against age-related decline. But I will say that based on the handful of opportunities I've had to train with him, I'd say he's winning that fight so far. Chris is currently the head of performance innovation at BeaverFit USA. So if you're wondering how to better utilize BeaverFit equipment at your unit, he'll blow your mind. He also had a pretty influential role at TRX. You'll hear a little bit about that in the episode. But frankly, this episode is not about either BeaverFit or TRX. We get into some really fun, nerdy stuff that's not really related to either of those, but is super relevant to military human performance.
We go all over. We go all over.
I think we were 40 minutes into the recording before either of us asked him a question we had actually planned ahead of time.
Well, in fairness, we only had planned like a few.
That's true. We were kind of texting each other
Yeah.
20 minutes before the episode, figuring out what the plan
Yes.
was. And thankfully, a plan was irrelevant. We didn't need it.
Which is a much more frequent occurrence than I think people realize.
It's more common than I think people realize, yes, that we have unplanned episodes. But I would also say that whether we plan something or don't plan something, the episodes that end up the best are the ones that go off the rails immediately and don't stick to the plan. And this is
We
one of
never
those.
we didn't even step foot on the rails. Maybe we
No.
did in some places. Anyway,
At the very end, we asked a couple of actual planned questions.
we did. And again, we mentioned this in the outro as well, but Chris will be back. We will talk to Chris about more things because, as you will very quickly realize listening to this episode, he has a lot to offer. We danced around a lot of rabbit holes. We could have really dove into any of them, and I think in future episodes we probably will. But yeah, one of the geniuses in the space. Happy to have him. Finally made it work. And as a member of Leg Tuck Nation, he's listening to this. Chris, thanks for coming on.
He is. He does demonstrate during the episode that he's listened to quite a few of the episodes. That's pretty cool to
Familiar with our
hear.
canon.
I'll also say, and this is at the end of every episode, but we'll make it particularly clear on this one. I'm not sure if Chris said it before or after we hit the record button, but he is here in his own personal capacity. So if any of the
It's true.
BeaverFit homies are listening, please don't fire him.
Chill out. Or you could, well, I was gonna say fire him, we'll hire him, but we could afford Chris. Anyway,
I don't think we can afford
it don't fire him. So yeah, enjoy. Chris, where are you right now?
I'm currently based out of Northern California, San Rafael, California.
Okay.
Soon to be relocating, destination TBD. We just became empty nesters about a year ago, and dude, I love
Congratulations.
California. I live like in the best spot, but dude,
Yeah.
I'd have to like hit the lottery like 4 times to think about buying a house. But
If you have to choose your next destination, where would you want it to be?
if I had to choose it, or if I had to choose between the 2 options I got to go to, what would it be? If I could choose any place,
If you
I'd
have,
go
I didn't know
to-
you had 2 options. What are your 2 options?
One's Albuquerque. We have a house there. My wife's from there. My mom's family's from there. We have a house there. We're looking to go back and spend some time fixing it up, and either roost there or sell it. And when I say fixing it up, dude, I can't change a light bulb. My wife, on the other hand, can tile, can drywall. She can do everything except electrical. So I'm going back there to basically hold her tool belt. The other option is to head up to Reno, headquarters for BeaverFit.
Hmm.
Uh,
So
and
desert,
we'll,
either way, you're in the desert.
Well, you say desert, but Reno's got surprisingly good mountain access, and actually Albuquerque doesn't have that bad mountain
Stop it,
access either.
dude. I'm sitting in North
Yeah.
Carolina. That's the desert to me.
You can get from Reno to Tahoe pretty quick.
Oh yeah, piece of cake.
Yeah.
I guess that's
It's
true.
not what you think. You got to picture like it's right on the border. Yeah.
I just picture Vegas.
Have you guys actually met each other?
I don't think so. I think we might have been on a call here and there.
Maybe
for
that's
some
what it
things.
was. I mean, I know your
But-
name, obviously.
Yeah.
And part of me was like, I'm fairly confident I met him at a conference somewhere or another, but
Yeah, it probably was like a TSAC or
I'm sure.
Some other
Good to
NSCA
see you
or something
slash
like
meet
that.
you slash
So-
Yeah,
hello.
you too.
Drew, so you have been to conferences? Like you do go
Yeah.
sometimes?
In my previous life, when the Air Force paid for me to go, the Army makes it very difficult, and so I don't
I
even
can't
try.
get Drew to go to anything.
I hate conferences so much. Yeah, the Air Force, we would do What's the International Congress on Soldiers' Physical Performance? Mostly because it was in cool places, Quebec. But yeah, TSAC and SCA, I have a hard time.
I've been told so many times how I missed out on the Quebec ICSPP. I heard fantastic things about that.
It was cool. It was also cold as shit because it was in February, January, February.
Didn't they give out like beanies to everybody because it was
Beanies
cold?
that are way too tight. I still have mine and it gives me a headache, so I don't wear it. But the beanies were cool, just too tight.
Mm.
So
Well, I was lucky enough to have Chris as an instructor for my TRX level 3 once upon a time.
That's right. I don't keep many things, but that little plaque you guys gave me, that's one of like 2 or 3 things I have hanging out in my office. I had a blast that time.
There we go.
I thought you were about to say I don't keep many things, but I do have a TRX.
Hey, you want to go down a dark hole there? We can.
Ooh, that's one we got to explore then.
I want to
'Cause
ask you a dumb question. What is a level 3 TRX versus a 2 versus a 1?
3 is at that point you were instructing instructors how to instruct other people. So it was like a train the trainer as opposed to train a fitness kind of club setting or train an end user.
And I will say, I go into a lot of certs, but like honestly, particularly that one, I went in with like not the highest expectations necessarily for it being like a super interesting thing, and Chris made it awesome. It was a lot more than like a how to use a TRX conversation. So
You actually told me that either that day or shortly thereafter, and I was like, okay, that's a win because one thing I've been called in the past is the anti-salesman because I go in and it just so happens that there's a piece of equipment or a modality or something, but I just try to keep it in context of how you're going to use it, who's using it, what makes sense on it. There's a guy named Tim Burke that I used to work with, and the way we got the straps into most of pro sports, because he is like the Rain Man of sports. Like you go to a conference with him and some coach would come up to him and he'd say, "Oh yeah, you're the assistant to so and so, and you were at here before, and you know what? Your cousin's dog walker and my niece's best friend were, into school." So Tim would walk me into a place, and then we would just talk about, hey, how they're training, because I just have pretty interesting coaching tree background, and by the end we would spend 10 minutes on a particular product, but then they just got the context of it. So that felt comfortable in that situation back at the Army Physical Fitness School.
Nice. Can we ask about the TRX dark hole? I'm mostly just curious. If it becomes its own episode, that's one thing, but what is this dark hole we speak of?
I will dance this one. TRX was my first private sector. Before that, I was all education. I've taught middle school, high school, community college, 4-year graduate school. I had helped found a charter school in Albuquerque, and I spent I don't know 2 years out on the PGA Tour, 3 years out on the PGA Tour with
Nice.
a couple of athletes. That's a whole episode. Came across TRX, gave it to my athlete. He liked it. Took a job there in 2008, and it was great. I got there just as it was on the upswing. I kind of helped stand up. There was a team of us over there, but a lot of brain power around standing up training and education. And it was all, dude, it was all great until I started to run into, oh, this is what corporate America is like. And then I realized, because my wife used to kid me that that was my first real job, because every other job, when you're the teacher, you kind of run the show. You have to answer to administration and principals. But she was like, I'm just holding my breath until you come home that one day with your hair on fire when I had some. And yeah, it happened. So I probably stayed there a few years too long, but great experience. It's just sometimes things don't turn out the way you were painted up that picture to be. But it was great. I wouldn't have traded anything for those times.
Hmm.
Well, when you taught the class, you were doing a really good job of putting on a true believer face. Were you in fact a true believer to the degree you portrayed at the time?
I'm a true believer in physics, and I'm a true believer in taking
Carefully answered.
those straps and turning them into something that people don't expect them to be. That far, I'm a true believer. I'm never one great at drinking Kool-Aid, but the good thing was, and I'll probably somewhat regret saying this, the good thing was at that time, most of the Kool-Aid was being made out of what came out of my head. And so I didn't really have a conflict there. So that felt good. And honestly, Alex, when I was standing in front of you guys, dude, it ain't about what I'm teaching or what I'm, what brand I'm part of. It's like, hey, how am I going to help you guys do what you need to do better? So that was all authentic. One thing I'm really bad at, as you can tell from the last 3 minutes, is dancing lines. I'm pretty straightforward most of the time.
I don't know. And I don't mean to make this all about TRX, but as you're talking, I'm curious because I remember when I was part of a group that kind of stood up, you could call it a CrossFit program at like a YMCA, and we shared a space with the TRX class. And so, you would go in and there'd be 10, 15 people doing split squats on a TRX. That's the extent of my exposure to TRX, other than owning one somewhere in my garage. Like, is the whole philosophy just like, this is all you need, don't do anything else? Or does it include other things? I just don't know.
Oh, dude. It was that like we said, that's when we got into the pro rooms, we'd walk in and we'd say two things. Before we'd walk in, we'd say, hey, one of the greatest things about a set of straps is you can do 1,000 different things on them. One of the worst things about a strap is you can do 1,000 different things on them. So nobody knows what to do on them.
Yep.
So they do chest presses and they do rows and they put it away. We walk in and we say, hey, what are you guys doing for flexibility and mobility work? And hey, what are you doing for core work? Let me show you how this thing can really become cool. So if you think about from a flexibility, mobility, my feet are on the deck, my hands are in straps. So it's not quite closed chain. It's not quite open chain, but I can anchor in here and move into different joint positions, unload myself, get into those. Pretty money. I helped stand up a couple of, and I know these are Drew's favorite things, help stand up a couple of university clinical studies looking at the effectiveness of suspension training on different kind of muscle activation. So that felt really good. And then as a brand, as any brand would be, you guys are a brand, you take that as far as you can. And did sometimes, like any other brand, we kind of go maybe a little too far, maybe, but we had such a good foundation in, hey man, it's physics, gravity, motor learning. That's not going anywhere. So we can jump in there. I think, Alex, when I did that class, it had been about 6 or 7 months that I'd kind of been really pushing this concept called the Daily 8, which I gave to you guys. It was just like, hey, if all you ever did with the straps for the rest of your life were these 8 exercises, you'd get 70% of the benefit you need to get out of it. And then go pick up something heavy, go swing a kettlebell, go run, rock and roll.
Along the way of having that chat, you used a term that I've heard you discuss at length a little bit, which was modalities. And I don't know if we're triggering you here or not. It's a little bit intentionally trying to trigger you, but I want to know kind of how would you define that term, or how do you think that term gets used or misused?
Oh, I love that, dude. It's like I planted that one. About 2 or 3 years ago, I don't know how you guys are with either fitness or training or anything else, but my brain just never turns off on it. And someone just said in passing, hey, we're going to train with some different modalities today. We're going to use a kettlebell and we're going to use a barbell and we're going to use body weight. And I'm going, that just doesn't feel right. So fast forward to I get on the call with a buddy of mine who teaches physical therapy, and I say, hey, I know you guys use the word modalities a lot. How do you guys use it? Oh, we use it for E-stim, we use it for massage, we use it for active release technique. And I'm like, okay, so the way typically I hear, and honestly, the way I did for a long time, use modalities doesn't make sense. So I can pick up a kettlebell and I can swing it, and I'll call that a ballistic exercise. I can then do a shoulder press. That's not really a ballistic exercise. That's more of a grind. I could do that same exercise with a dumbbell. So where I am now, which is plyometrics is a modality, swinging a kettlebell well is kind of in that same modality. Doing a grind is a type of modality. But implements aren't modalities. I could pick up an implement and do different modalities on there. There's probably a few things like, hey, if you say you jump in the pool, that's a modality, but it's that I'm somewhat nervous for your listeners because I've listened to you guys enough, and we could end up going down some crazy rabbit holes that people will just go, yeah, I don't know what you guys are talking about anymore. But modalities is an interesting one.
Well, if you had to like pick a few things that you would agree are in fact modalities, you already said like aquatics kind of counts as a modality. It's got enough unique factors to it that you can make that a category. What else do you think counts as a modality in your mind?
I think ballistic, and I kind of adapt, and I'm really I try to be good at giving attribution to people that taught me things or opened my eyes to things. I haven't been for a while, but I used to go out to dinner with Pavel probably 4 or 5 times a year. And if you guys have not spent time listening to Pavel's stuff, man, I don't want to say clearly I don't know everybody in the industry. He is one of the smartest guys in terms of application, but also science. This is, here we go on a sidetrack. We were sitting at dinner one night talking about conditioning, which is one of my big things. And he just said in passing, yeah, because if your diaphragm gets fatigued, then you start diminishing blood flow to your legs, and such happens. And I was like, excuse me, rewind that for a second. He goes, and he just says it like, by the way, yeah, this, and this. And so I'll ask him, what's that based off of? And he literally quotes off the top of his head some 70-year-old, of course, Russian study. Go home that night, look it up. Can't find that study, but find an updated study that says, hey, once you start to get fatigue in your diaphragm, afferent signals go back, and you actually do start to occlude blood flow a little bit to the lower body for whatever reasons. So I said that to say this, is he likes to put a continuum from ballistics to grind. So ballistics, think of jumping. You actually have to leave the ground. You have to throw the ball, or something has to be where at the end of that range of motion, you're trying to accelerate through that range of motion. So it's not a speed squat. Speed squat is a speed move, or you might call it a power move. So you've got ballistics is a type of modality that could go across different areas. Explosive. Explosive means that you're trying to move as fast as you can. And we can have interesting gray areas on how fast you actually moving. You got a heavy bar on your chest for a bench press, and you're trying to move it as fast as you can, and it moves fast because it's 35, 40% of your 1RM, or if it's 85% of your 1RM and it's moving slowly. Is that explosive? The intent is there. I think there has to be kind of a speed component of it. So we got ballistic, we got explosive. Then you got the cyclical types of things we talk about, get on a rower, get on a bike, go on running. I don't call strength training a modality. I think strength training is a lot of modalities. Here's an interesting one, and then I'll stop because I'll just keep going. Static dynamic exercise, which I first heard from Pavel, but I know he was quoting somebody else. So think about doing push-ups. Is you're moving, but there's this constant tension in your muscles. So there's enough tension in your muscles to occlude the blood flow to the muscles. So even though you're getting this endurance component on there, because you've minimized the amount of vascular flow, you're not removing waste products, you're not sending in more oxygen. So you are really getting into this, another trigger word for Drew, anaerobic area on there.
Oh, man.
But this is another one from Pavel. If you get, let's go with rucking. You go rucking with a decent amount of weight on your back. Every time that leg hits the ground, high tension, different type of motor unit recruitment, occlude blood flow. But when that leg comes off the deck, opens up enough so you can kind of push those things through there. So both of those could be considered some type of endurance. But because of the pulsatile blood flow going in there, I look at those as two different kinds of modality. And then you start to figure out how you can play with those types of things. One thing, I forgot who I learned this from. I know it was a Russian person. Think of high load, low cadence cycling. So get on a bike, put it so you're in like the 30 RPM area, but you're trying really hard. And so that's that kind of same thing of high contraction, different type of motor unit recruitment, occlude blood flow, but you get enough recovery in between. And the theory is, I haven't been able to find research on it, but sure, it does have a great narrative. You can increase the mitochondrial capability of fast twitch fibers because you're recruiting those fast twitch fibers and forcing them to work in this pulsatile blood flow. So I like that as a modality, but you can see how far we get into this dark area of how does that make sense? Whole other conversation.
Well, I'm going to ask this question. Alex and I were chatting on the side about this because as you're talking, I'm thinking of a lot of the stuff that we've talked about twice now, I think, with Evan.
I always get messages from Chris after Evan PyCon episodes. That's a pretty predictable,
Like in a good way or a bad way?
in a discussion way.
Okay, perfect.
This is why we got Chris here.
Well, because what's coming to mind is you're talking about these different modalities, and just for curiosity, I Googled modality just to see what the actual definition is. Because I'm one of those who, multimodal. I probably got that from CrossFit or OPEX or something. A particular mode in which something exists or is experienced or expressed. Sounds very fancy. And I'm wondering if you could almost at a really nerdy level classify modalities based on hemodynamics and just the relationship of like occlusion, all the different things having to do with blood flow. And then to Alex's point, who gives a shit? I got excited.
I would say, and this will be kind of a umbrella thing that I'll come back to. You guys may or may have heard, I don't know who I'm stealing this from, the difference between a coach and a play stealer. A coach is somebody who develops plays for his team. Play stealers watch what he does and takes those plays, and he might go out and be successful with them. The difference between a coach and a play stealer is when a coach is running a play and that play doesn't work because, hey, your key man gets nicked and he gets injured, or the defense starts to adapt to it, or it's raining, or whatever one of these things on there. A coach understands what are the principles behind how he created that play. And he's like, no problem, I can tweak that. Play stealer's like, oh shit, now what? And I kind of go back and forth. I'm kind of at the stage of my career and my thinking of, I'm really happy that I know a lot of nerdy stuff. But at this point in my life, it's, man, not just how do you make it simple, but how do you make it actionable? And how do you identify the important from the interesting? And sometimes the interesting becomes important, but that's kind of a cutting edge way to think about my coaching, at least as I've evolved over these years.
Well, you're setting up a few things we want to talk about. One, I don't want to breeze past because some fragments of our audience might not understand what a flex it is to just casually mention hanging out with Pavel all the time.
I was about to go down the deepest of rabbit holes, so I'm glad you jumped in. I was like, dude, we could talk about philosophy. Anyway, keep going.
Let's go.
Well, I think that's important, but we won't spend a bunch of time on that because we've talked about
No one
Pavel
will listen.
20 different times on this.
Oh, you have? I didn't know that.
Have we?
I did
He's been mentioned in passing. We haven't gone deep on it.
He's
at
the
all.
guy that brought kettlebells to America. Although people say that as though he's the Christopher Columbus of kettlebells. Like, were they here before, or did he like show up on a boat with some poods and here we are? I don't even know that story.
I think if you're going to be in the coaching space, you have to listen to some audiobook Pavel content. You have to hear it delivered in that voice. Whether you take it and use it, I don't care, but you have to have that experience.
Hey, there's a few folks in the industry that I will say, if you're not listening to this person, you're missing an opportunity to have an oh shit moment. And Pavel, for me, I was not expecting it. I mean, I followed Pavel for quite a while. He and I did a project together when I was at TRX, and you guys will probably Google it as soon as I say it. We did 2 exercise videos combining straps and kettlebells.
Oh no.
So we got to spend some time together doing that. But as of day one, man, he was just dropping bombs left and right. And man, I've got to hang out with Stu McGill if you want to talk about that. I got to hang out with, Gray and Lee and still consider them friends. I've got to hang out with, I met Solyanov. I've met all these guys just because I've had just a kind of blessed area here. When somebody says, hey, I only have one thing to do, I can only read one thing. What's my go-to? Learn how to use a kettlebell hard style.
Yeah.
Hard style.
We have said that before. And I know we're going to talk about assessments here in a second, but like I still think the long cycle would be our military would look so different if we were doing a long cycle for the PT test.
Dude, they're just simple and sinister.
Yeah. Yeah.
Get-ups. If you're not doing get-ups, or at least trying not to do get-ups,
I'm going to write this down because a couple weeks back, I was like, man, I need to do more kettlebells. And I was going back through all the Pobble shit. I don't know if you're like me, but I'll do something. I'll forget about it for a couple years. I'll come back like it's the newest thing ever. And I'm like, oh, I was doing this shit 5 years ago. Turkish
I
kettlebells.
mean, we did do our garage gym episode not that long ago, and we did put both kettlebells and TRX straps high on the list of like you could get a lot done with this.
Well, now we need nitric oxide monitors because we're talking about blood flow physiology as a way of classifying modalities. So just throw that in the garage too.
We're getting close to one of the key topics. We haven't even touched any questions we planned yet, to be honest.
Let's go.
One of the key ones we want to get to is what you talked about last year at TSEC, which is the assessments thing. But before we get there, because I don't want to lose it, because you kind of brought it up a second ago, you talked about like all the nerdy stuff we spend time learning in books and articles and talking about in audiences like this, but trying to make it simple and make it practical and make it useful for people who aren't going to make this their whole career and things like that. And because we're going to spend part of the rest of this conversation talking about like trends in the military and the DoD and things like that, that comes to mind to me as one of the biggest challenges the DoD has is we have people up at that super smart PhD level getting studies done, publishing results, creating resources. And then we have people down at the end user level, like minimal subject matter expertise, education, training, and things like that. And we have this huge gap in the middle where the PhDs are like trying to produce content, but they forget who their audience is and they produce stuff that's going over the head of these people or is not practical for the environment they actually work in. And I do this to myself all the time. I don't have a question at the end of this rambling I'm doing. I'm just curious about your thoughts on this like communication gap we seem to have where there are super smart people at the top analyzing really nuanced, nerdy things, and then people who just need practical guidance for their real life situation at the bottom. And instead they're getting tons and tons of published research that they can't use.
Yeah, dude, I definitely have a position on this. And I will requalify some of your statements. I would say some of the super smartest people I've ever met don't have a PhD.
Fair.
Don't have a master's. I guess my buddy, the guy I'm thinking of, does have his master's. A guy named Eddie Saw, who was my mentor as soon as I got out of college in terms of coaching. I will say, because some people know this, it took me 23 years to finish my PhD, just for whatever reasons. That's a whole other episode of stuff that would have to be R-rated. But during that time, the cool thing about having to be engaged in that was not only looking at the evolution of exercise science and the academic game, but the different personalities and types of folks that would come through an exercise science program at University of New Mexico, but also all the conferences we go to, because, dude, I'm not going to go too far back on this, but exercise science came out of really back in the day, some version of home economics. And then it was in the physical education department. And then all of a sudden people started to see, oh, there's can be some money made on this. And then it got adopted into a lot of medical schools across the board. But early back in the day, it was people that mostly wanted to go into cardiac rehab and some physical therapy schools as we went across. And our ability to keep up with the technology drove us to ask some questions that started to get further and further away from application and into pure science, which I think is great. But let me go back and use the kettlebell as a metaphor. If there's a study sitting out there, it's like a kettlebell. If you pick it up and you can't figure out how to use it, Sometimes it's not the kettlebell's fault. Um, and sometimes it's just like, yeah, you know what? When you get your PhD, what they tell you is for right now, for an hour, for 2 hours, for a week, for a month, you are the smartest person on this super slim, deep area that you're going into. And there's something to be said about that. I mean, at the end of the day, I tell all the, because of everybody who ever got a PhD in the world, I'm probably the most unlikely one. You know, it's like a lot of life. 80% of it is showing up. But the whole idea is to use a microcosm of what you're studying to understand the bigger picture, and then also use the bigger picture to relate it back to the microcosm of what's going on. And so what I would say to your question, which is a great question, is let me ballpark it. Anybody who graduated with an exercise science related degree of any kind, or especially PhD, in the last 15 years is a different mindset than people that came before them because, hey, now at that time, no one was talking about autophagy. Nobody was talking about being able to understand what's going on inside the cell at the molecular level that we could start to use all these computers on. So the questions we ask kind of go down this road. But at the end of the day, I don't say smart versus not smart. I'd say back to this, important versus interesting. There's a lot of people studying a lot of interesting things that help craft what somebody smarter than me calls crystallized knowledge. So I got a bunch of facts floating around in my head. What I do, and what I'm seriously impressed about with, I hate to use this term, but I will, your generation of exercise and sports science is their fluid intelligence, their ability to bring all these things together and push them out fast. The only advantage I have, I mean, this is like me playing basketball. The old man just understands where to be at the right time to fill in gaps because I got a lot of knowledge out here. I think, and this is what's got me super motivated for H2F, FFI, all these opportunities is there's a group of folks like me who the urgency is to leave a legacy, not of our name, but not the shoulders that you guys are standing on, but the shoulders we were standing on. I think I'm kind of this gap of, I mean, you guys have talked about what's the high school in California that you guys were just
La
talking about?
Sierra.
La
Yeah, La
Sierra.
Sierra High School. I mean, those are the coaches that I grew up with. And
Yeah,
then all
Stan
of a sudden we
Prati.
started using all these big words and people get excited with big words. Dude, knowledge is like technology. It's only, it's the technology that people understand and find useful. It's going to be successful. Knowledge is going to be what people understand and find useful. Is going to make successful. And I think that's a really interesting gap that I look to help fill on there. Because yeah, I'll pick up the most obscure article on PGC1 alpha and being able to look at muscle activation on there. And just because I'm sure I'm disturbed in some way that hasn't been diagnosed, I can kind of put that into context. But at this point, at a certain point, if it's not really going to impact how we're talking about H2F coaches, small unit leaders, if it's not going to impact how they're going to program and coach, then it's just interesting. And let's keep the interesting things kind of on the sidelines and identify the important things and make them the starters.
This is kind of I'm rebuking myself here because, as you mentioned, I have such a cynical take on research, mostly because it's a bit, but also maybe because it's not. Do you think that for our industry, and I think of like a bell curve in some sense, and maybe on the far right of that bell curve, you have like this super cutting edge, high performer, 1% of 1%. I mean, the Olympics is going on. So, like, at that level, they're dealing with such fine margins. Some of that research might actually be really important. But for most of us who are dealing with like gen pop types, we have a hard time understanding why people might be pursuing those questions because for us, it's like the only things that really matter are relationships and like compliance. And I don't need a strength and conditioning journal to write a paper to tell me that that's important. Do you think that some of that disconnect exists because so few of us actually see that cutting edge piece, or is it just kind of a self-licking ice cream cone?
That's a good question. I'm not even sure that on those outer edges, these pure science things are actually going to give an advantage to those folks. It may or may not. I think the disconnect is how you're framing how in general the question is framed. Before I came on with BeaverFit, Alex, one of the co-founders of BeaverFit USA, just said, "Hey, look, here's the mission we're going after across the military. You've got people with a bunch of different fitness levels. They've got things they got to be able to do related to their MOS. Oh yeah, and we got to be able to scale it around the planet." I was like, man, give me any two of those, and it's really hard. Give me all three of those, and it's probably the dumbest thing you could ever try. Dude, I'm all in. And so it really, when we try to figure those things out, how do you use whatever information or research or anything's out there to help solve that problem? And I think that's where it gets us. I think the biggest problem, not only in our industry, but a lot of sciences in general, is people go from thinking of a question to providing their thoughts on the answer of that question without going through the intermediate stages of, hey, preparation. What are those stages I just came across recently? I really like preparation, incubation, illumination, validation, and then communication. Everybody wants to go from preparation to communication. Man, there's nothing like, how many times you've been in the shower, many times you've been out on a run, how many times you've been doing something that has nothing to do with the problem you've been working on, and it just pops into your head that way. And Drew, I would 100% agree with you that there's an academic issue, having been in there for a while, that, publish or perish. Man, it's volume. It's straight up volume. It's not intensity. It's not periodization. It's volume. How many of these studies can I get pushed out? So yeah, that's kind of, I'm not sure if I answered the question. You weren't sure if you
Well,
asked,
I have a
Alex, but that's
follow
kind
on,
of
and
where I
I
ended
know
up.
Alex is going to be pissed that I have a follow on, but because you seem well positioned to answer this, and we've asked this question before I think Ketchy was the one that we were talking about research. Is there a way to reshape that side of the industry so that what's coming out of academia actually plays into the hands of coaches? We've mentioned publishing training logs and things like that. I mean, I've been a strength coach for a long time. I can tell you I can count on maybe three fingers how many times I've opened up the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research to like pull something that would impact what happens on a Tuesday morning. But then I think about like the Norwegian speed skater that threw his entire training log online, and coaches like swarmed to it because it was so interesting. That to me seems like a much better use of like science and academia than, hey, here's the difference in a freaking high pull versus whatever the one Alex and I were laughing at a couple of days ago.
Please, I remember hearing that one. Yeah, but you're definitely not going to like my answer.
Good. I don't want to. I
The
want
way
you to be
to
honest with me.
the way to fix that problem is the way you fix any other consumer versus producer problem. Producer ain't never going to change anything unless the consumer gets more picky in what they do. And honestly, do I think we're going to change the way academia is done? Probably not. The most important thing we can do is, data literacy is a big, term right now. Just think of journal literacy. I mean, I
Mm.
think I actually used to cover this in some workshops when I was at the university. Was pick up a journal article, let me show you how to skim it real quick. Um, and it's not so much that you want to be able to read it on Monday and use it on Tuesday. Can you pull a few things out of there? Uh, and I'd have to go back and figure out what that list is, that are going to sit in the back of your brain until they move from being interesting to being important. Or as you start to, I mean, this is another advantage of being an old guy. When I used to go to the library and I had to take my card there and Xerox a bunch of copies from Journal of Applied Physiology, and you're looking for a particular article, and as you're thumbing through the pages, you see the title of this article, and then you read that article. And so you start to just accumulate all this information, and then you start to see trends, start to see connective tissue rolling through here. I think the short answer to your question is, as fitness professionals, as strength and conditioning professionals, as human performance professionals, one skill I don't see a lot of is how to consume information in general and consume research specifically. And you know why that is? Because it ain't fun, man. You can't skip over the method section. You gotta understand the stats part of the results. And you gotta look at the discussion and conclusions and say, wait a minute, are there conclusions you're coming to here? Are you telling me 1 + 1 is 2? Or are you telling me 1 + 1 is green? And we just gotta hold people accountable.
So Drew said right before he asked that question that I was going to be mad about him asking it. And when he started asking it, I wasn't mad at him because it was fine. I love these riffs going on. And
Have more.
I got mad at him because you started without either of us asking it, you started answering one of our only planned questions for this podcast. We got like 40 minutes into this thing before we got to like any kind of planned content, and it came up
But are we
organically instead of
coaching
us
or are we
asking.
play stealing right now? I mean, like right now we're coaching. So onwards and upwards, I say.
Let's go. What is it?
Well, so you've already stated most of this, so maybe we're asking you to restate it. But what do you think the data literacy or research literacy requirements are for human performance professionals in this space? Like how literate does someone need to be on that stuff to be functional? And it certainly depends on the role in the echelon and things like that. But what do you think those basic expectations need to look like?
That's a great question. And I'll preface it by saying something that doesn't sound like I'm answering the question. You go to the best universities, the best programs, not necessarily by name, but the best universities. And in their 101 intro class to whatever they're teaching, psychology, economics, physics, exercise phys, they have their best professors teaching 101 and describing it in a way that the freshmen can understand the value of that spoken in their language that makes sense. It's not a TA. It's not a highly published researcher that's really talking in language they can't talk about. So I would say that beginning entry level is around the idea of statistical thinking, meaning that, hey, the world's built on probabilities. What does probability mean? Let's spend a lot of time talking about playing poker. Let's talk about a lot of things where you got to have skin in the game, where you have to suss out the environment you're in. You have to identify your biases, put them to the side. You got to make a play, and then you got to put yourself in an environment where you can get good feedback as quickly as you can, and then start to iterate on that. And just getting that concept of probability down, I think is going to open the doors to a bunch of other things. The fact you can jump on a program or at this point now just drop it into ChatGPT and get the statistic output. So what? I think the great thing about ChatGPT is explain to me what correlation is and what are the best cases for it and where does it not make sense. If I were back teaching again, probably one of the assignments that I would give my students is using ChatGPT, come up with, and I just did this a couple of months ago and it turned out to be harder than I thought. Come up with a test. Maybe this will get us into our testing conversation. Come up with a test that you think would make sense on a bike with weights or anything like that. And so in statistics, there's something called a Monte Carlo method, meaning that, hey, if I only got 2 or 3 subjects, how can I take the way that their subjects behaved and then clone that information based on mean standard deviation and create a bunch of different other people out there. So come up with a test, come up with a way that you would want that test to look. How would you measure it? What do you think it would do? And then use ChatGPT to help you generate a data set of 10 different people that would go through that. Now we're not talking about what's a mean, what's a standard deviation, what's probability, what's p values here. It's really trying to teach kids how teach kids physics by having them build a popsicle bridge that can hold, half a pound of weight. Man, they're totally bought in after that. And then they're looking over and seeing, how did the kid next to me build theirs? How can I pull all these things in? Now there's skin in the game, man. Now I want to know more about how I solve these probability issues. And now the boring math takes on a lot of meaning. That wasn't a great answer, but I would say you better understand probability. You should be able to read an article and update how you think about things based on that information. And then you can start digging into, hey, I need to take a stats class, or I need to pick up statistics and kinesiology or something along those lines. Does that refine my answer if that doesn't really hit your question? I mean, the easiest thing I would say is, hey, I should start a data literacy online program and everybody should take it because stats and kettlebells, that's going to be me till the end of the day.
Stay tuned. Mops and Mo's will be launching a data literacy program with Chris Frankel very soon. Just stole that one from you. Anyway.
I know Drew has some follow-up stuff there, but I just have to check. You're essentially a teacher living in California talking about math. You've seen Stand and Deliver, right?
Heck yeah.
Okay, because we're basically doing the how do I teach these kids? Like it's
Fingerman. Dude, that's how I learned my nines tables.
Yes. I did not think that reference was going to come up in this episode.
Stand and Deliver and Moneyball.
There you go.
Moneyball. I'm such a huge fan of Moneyball. There's so many implications for strength and conditioning, which brings me to my next riff, and I'm being intentionally inflammatory here. Are strength coaches too dumb, or is strength coaching academia too smart? Because I'm hearing you say a lot of things about data literacy, and I will give you those. I think that you're spot on. I also wonder how this, behemoth that is exercise physiology, exercise science, academia, what have you, there seems to be this push from that side that keeps saying, just be better at reading our stuff. Just be smarter at reading our stuff. It's like, well, cool. My response is, why are you writing like that? I can go on Instagram. Pavel, Strong But Sinister, that's a blog post. Like I can go there. That is interesting and important. So I would pursue that as a strength coach before I go and read the thing you wrote, because the thing you wrote makes no sense. Like you've written it for other people like you. So how do you is there something there in the middle? And this may be just a repetition of the question that I asked you earlier, but I can't imagine that the academic rigidity that we currently have in place can survive the social media onslaught that is becoming contemporary exercise science, if that makes sense. Like I know more coaches that go to Marcus Philly's Instagram that go to the NSCA.
I'll add a layer to this one because we're starting to talk about like industry trends kind of stuff. But essentially, the foot in the door requirement to call yourself a strength and conditioning coach means you have to like dip your toes into like a little bit of awareness of research, but not necessarily a lot of depth on that stuff. You have to read secondary sources that are referencing some of that stuff. You have
to read the essentials of strength and conditioning and take a test online.
Yeah. So we agree on that. We can use.
I get what you're
terms.
saying. Like ideally, sure, you will have cracked open and abstract versus method. I know those words, but like those people don't. Coaches don't know.
The situation that creates is, I would say in a lot of cases, strength and conditioning coaches will love to explain to you why they are so much more qualified than a personal trainer. But personal trainers with degrees in like nothing or something irrelevant and like no real exposure to that stuff, we don't really care about that stuff. The best personal trainers are having more impact on their populations than a lot of strength and conditioning coaches. And I don't think it was how much knowledge of the literature do you have that makes the difference in who's having more impact and who's more effective. I don't know.
Dude, there's a lot to unpack there. In fact, there's so much I had to start taking notes.
Let's unpack. Please, let's unpack. This can go as long as you want because this is one of the hills I want to die on aside from fast food on military installation.
I'm going to spin back to, and you guys have both used the term smart for these PhDs. One thing my mom taught me, and you said stand and deliver, completely non sequitur. My mom actually helped stand up the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. So both my mom and my dad came from super poor. My mom's family's from Mexico. My dad's from Ukraine. My mom used to tell me, A, students run the world, C, students come along and fix it. And that is always stuck with me.
Nice.
So
that's beautiful.
Isn't that great? And so when we talk about academia and publishing, got to come back to, hey, what's the game we're playing? What does success look like? If I'm a PhD, if I'm an academic PhD, I'm striving for tenure. Man, tenure is a good deal, man. The reason you get into it is you get tenure. How do I get tenure? I got to do this. I got to do this. I got to publish. What does that mean, publish? That means I got to get into this journal. Okay, how do I get into this journal? The journals are going to be reviewed by this. This is what you're going to be sussed out on here. So there's a lot of researchers that are writing, especially think in our industry, there's a lot of researchers that are writing with the coach and the applied side in mind, but they also still just have to get up to this level of peer-reviewed research. Enter the internet, where all you have to do to publish on the internet is publish on the internet. There's starting to be some in-betweens, like the data-driven strength guys that you had on that, I think those guys are super sharp. I think that's kind of the future of where we're going with this. And folks that don't want to or don't have the interest in, and God bless them, that they don't want to learn statistics and they don't want to read research articles and figure all those things out, they're going to have trusted partners and trusted sources to go to. And I think that's what it's going to end up being. And we're going to have to come up with a way that you start to think those things through. I will say some of the smart, and when I say smart, how do you go from point A to point B? How do you go from where you are to where you need to be given the circumstances and equipment you have in front of you? Some of the smartest people I know definitely do not have a PhD. And I would say if I've worked with 30 graduate students when I was at the University of New Mexico in an instructor capacity, I'd put 2 of them in front of athletes. Doesn't make the rest of them bad. It's just who they are, but it's really figuring out what that game is. And then to kind of come to that S&C and fitness side, personal trainer, I spent a lot of time in the fitness business. Personal trainer, their responsibility is, let's take the business side off it, is to create that trusting relationship, because I don't care, elite athlete, soccer mom, golf dad, you're going in there in a relatively vulnerable situation. I'm unfit, I'm overweight, I just got divorced, I'm going to get divorced, I'm going to get married, just had a kid, all these types of things, and they're going to somebody for help. So them being able to get probably one of the most important metrics that I've heard you guys talk about is just consistency. Hey, if I can keep you coming back and if I can get you to work away from there, which then leads to what I think is an insidious potential problem in our industry of all these exercise science PhDs over here are writing stuff that doesn't make any sense and will never be able to use. And look, at the end of the day, if all you do is you show up every day and you do something, man, you're going to get great results. I see this pendulum swinging back to just do something, just do anything, and you'll be fine. I think the future of the industry is, it's not a great analogy, but I'm going to use it. A doctor, where you may show up for the doctor and it's a checkup and everything's good to go. And all you could have just done that doctor's call virtually, or you could have just mailed it in or had a phone call. But if you show up at the doctor's office and there's something wrong, that doctor may be able to figure out either how to identify that and address it quickly, or put them into somebody else's hands to be able to get there, which I think is kind of interesting in the H2F model. And we just have to understand that, in my opinion, whoever you're coaching to or teaching to or training to, you should be training to about 70% of your capability of knowledge. And you got a buffer of stuff that you may never use unless that one person comes in and they're super elite and can you take them up to the next phase. But more importantly, it's going to be somebody that's like, potentially I got to mitigate an injury, or I got to mitigate a overtraining, or something more important, I got to mitigate, some kind of behavioral issues. It comes in. And that's a big, it's like, I taught for a long time. Teachers are get the most thankless job out of anything you can do. I think the same thing with strength coaches. Dude, I've met some dumbass doctors. I've worked with some ridiculously dumb PhD people, and I've met some really smart personal trainers. I hate to put everybody in one thing. Then I'll break after this, because I know I talk a lot. And this kind of goes back to what you asked in terms of what do we know for data literacy? And I had this conversation with Andrew Thompson, I don't know, 3 years ago.
He's very data literate.
Listeners of the pod, Andrew's been invited. He just can't come on until he finishes his probationary period.
And I actually didn't know who Andrew was at the time. And I was at that point, I was on this high horse about strength coaches are basically practicing economics, except we're never asked to account for our forecasting, meaning somebody walks in or a group walks in and I'm responsible or you're responsible for training them. And what I'm doing today, and this is one thing I consider a good coach, what I'm doing today is I walk in, I see how you move, I see how you're feeling, know a little bit about you. I'm kind of time traveling, whatever it is, a month, 2 months, 6 months, a year into the future, knowing what I need you to be doing or knowing what you want to be doing. And then how do I come back here to know what I'm doing right now so then you can meet those requirements coming forward. And so basically what we're doing is we're betting, coming back to probability, coming back to Texas Hold'em. But you know what we never get called on is, and strength coaches hate it when I say this, we never get called on evaluating the success of our program based on, you start here at the beginning of this part of the pipeline. At the end of the pipeline, I'm thinking you should be here. And I've had more than one conversation with notable coaches who are like, yeah, we can't do that. There's so many other things going on. There's, things outside the weight room, things going on in their family, all these things. There's no way to measure that. And in my head, I'm like, that is not true. There is absolutely a way to measure those things. They might not be as accurate as you want them to be, but there are other ways to measure them. But we're basically working with the economics of a human being, and we're never being called to account of, if I do this, I'm basically forecasting that a month from now or 6 months from now, you're going to be here. But I never get called out to say, hey, I assumed you're going to be here and you're here. Let's figure out why. You're here. Let's figure out why. You're here. Let's figure out why. Let's put some skin in the game, not to constantly just prove us right or wrong, but to figure out how we get better. But we never get called on that. It's not wins. It's not losses. I think there's concepts around, there's ways around this idea of readiness. I think there's some ideas around the way people feel. I think there's some really good things, Drew, to your point about creating relationships and creating, I know you guys don't let, or I just saw the posting recently about buy-in. I actually like that term, but we can talk that one. But the thing I have about fitness folks and strength conditioning people, it's one of the fewer jobs, especially in the commercial sector, where all I got to do is wake up one day and say, hey, I'm a trainer. I'm going to go, spend 4 hours and get a certification. And we never get called out on, here's a success metric. You told me I was going to be here. I'm not here. Why not? And it can't just be, oh, because you drank too much, because you didn't listen to me away from there. I think we got to hold ourselves accountable, and then we'll start to see the profession kind of raise itself up.
I'll do a quick shout out because you mentioned the buy-in thing, and it gives me an excuse to link the blog in the show notes or whatever. But I did get a really good piece of feedback on it, like minutes before we hopped on this podcast. And it was from Brian McGuire, who you probably know. He's involved in the Marine Corps side of this whole human performance thing. And the point he made is that, well, the buy-in side, the term might be overplayed on the face-to-face coach to tactical professional level and stuff, where the buy-in conversation is happening in a real way, like legitimate buy-in, is the back of the house stuff with human performance professionals talking to decision makers and people who control budgets, because that is buy-in, that is money changing hands, that is people who control budgets spending larger and larger chunks of those budgets on this thing we call human performance. And that's happening in a big way. And so like maybe it's time for me to like step back and add nuance to the whole buy-in versus trust thing. But there are serious buy-in conversations happening when we are asking commanders and bureaucrats to give us X number of thousands or millions of dollars for this thing.
The buy-in thing seemed to become like a semantic.
It's a little semantic. A lot of what we do
virtue
in here is semantic.
signaling LinkedIn, like, oh, buy-in, that's not what buy-in. I'm not knocking you. I see these conversations happen, and all these coaches love a semantics argument, but they hate, to Chris's point, being held accountable for the fact that your athlete didn't do what you thought they would. And I want to come back to that. And I'm like teetering on the precipice of just an absolute cynical rabbit hole, and I don't want to fall into it. Because you've probably heard us.
I'm with you. Let's go.
Well, you've probably heard us say this before with coaching, and one of the kind of side quests here for us is like, man, how do we how do we elevate the profession? Because on these teams, and I go back to just personal experience, like sitting next to doctors, sitting next to physical therapist, like the strength coach is the lowest part of the totem pole from just a professional perception standpoint for whatever reason, barrier to entry being so low, perception of gray sweatpants. And, I hate that I keep knocking those guys, but it's just so easy. And I just don't know, like, because you mentioned a lot of good points. Like, how do we do that? Like, how do we get to a point where coaches are held accountable? And it's not just this regurgitation of here's the 12-week thing that I learned. And if you don't get to the end of this, it's your fault, not mine. Like it's the athlete's fault. This whole industry seems predicated on the fact that every program should work. Athletes are the reason why programs fail. It's not the coach. And I'm just curious, like I don't have an answer to that. I'll just keep bitching about it until somebody like fixes it for me. But what are your thoughts?
Uh, um, how do we, and the way you elevate any profession, that's kind of a broad statement, is, and I'm pretty sure Alex has heard me say this in some talk I've given before, that I used to be involved, like I said, helped found a school, the concept of school effectiveness. The most effective schools have three things. They have good leadership, so a principal, they have good continuing education for the teachers. Most important, shouldn't say most important thing, third thing is peer expectations. So if you're sitting in a classroom and 80% of that class is planning on going to college, chances are you're going to go to college regardless of where you're coming from. Same thing we do in the profession is that right leadership, taking it away to set those expectations and being very clear on what winning looks like, and being able to give examples of what's the game we're playing, how we're scoring it, understanding that we might not all agree on how we're scoring it, but we're going to agree that the way we're scoring it, we're going to use that to drive behaviors, both of small unit leaders, end users, H2F performance teams on there. We're going to have, at my current company, what we call a high give a fuck factor, meaning that we expect a lot out of each other. And then as a result, the people we're working with expect a lot out of us. And then they know that we expect a lot out of them. And just kind of creating this environment where we're constantly pushing to the right level at the right time. And that's more people than it is an industry. And it's finding those right leaders to kind of take us there. But it's hard because, like you said, it's one thing about strength and conditioning is there's very few things that don't work. Let's not get too sciencey about it. If you're showing up every day and you're doing something and then you do a little bit more, you do a little bit harder, you're going to get better. What's kind of that? Gray Cook introduced me to this term, God, 20 years ago. It stuck with me, this concept of a non-failure threshold. What's the level you need to be at where you're not going to fail? So his example was, hey, you show up to the combine, you put 50 linebackers in the room. I can't tell you who's going to be the next all-pro, but I can probably tell you the 5 or 6 that aren't going to make it just based on even testing or watching them go through those things. Maybe we flip the script that way and say, hey, I'm not trying to create the next best all-star. I'm trying to create a program where I am going to elevate that bottom quartile up a little bit, and let's go from there. And you guys tell me, you walk into, let's think about what these sparks are going to look like, and you're getting a company size element in their training. What percentage of those folks are like super excited to be there and trying to figure out how to, get their periodization just tied in right? And what percentage of people they're like, how am I going to grind through this? And then how do you create an environment where both ends of that spectrum can, if not thrive, at least get something out of it? And I think that's the other future of coaching on the DoD side of the house.
I want to hit on the part you said about peer accountability, because in my mind, we'll use H2F because everybody knows it, but more broadly, I think tactical strength and conditioning is incredibly unique for our industry because for a long time, it's been competitive sport. And in competitive sport, I could probably understand making a case why the coach for this team may not want to have his stuff reviewed by the coach from that team because there's a competitive advantage. And you could even probably put that into the commercial sector too, because, there's proprietary stuff with Nike versus Adidas and yada, yada, yada. But with tactical, we're all playing for the same team. And what I've noticed as somebody who leads one of those teams is that my medical providers, they have peer accountability. They have to go over each other's notes. If I'm an athletic trainer and I'm treating a patient, my notes get peer reviewed by other athletic trainers and it elevates the field. We don't have that same thing happening with strength and conditioning programming. And I guess I'm kind of like thinking through this as I'm saying it, but I'm wondering if with this emergence of tactical strength and conditioning, very quickly becoming one of the biggest sectors of strength and conditioning, is there a place for some sort of peer reviewed mechanism to kick in to where, hey, me as a coach, I just wrote this program. Here's my kind of programming philosophy. Does that hold up to all the other coaches in my space? Like, I just don't see a lot of that happening, because what I find is that at the end of the day, there's so much ego attached to the reps and sets and modalities that I'm prescribing. And I'm not going to share that with anybody, because I feel like if they critique it, they're critiquing me as a person. So I don't know. I mean, you've been in this industry longer than I have. I don't know if that's a route we could go down or not, but it just occurred to me as an opportunity.
I'll inject briefly to say that in my limited experience, it seems like when given the opportunity, coaches will avoid digging into another coach's programming because they don't want to go there because it's a potentially sensitive thing.
Well, they're dumb.
The over under on you saying idiot or dumb in my head was like 15 minutes. So I feel like there's been growth here today,
It's
Drew.
clickbait.
I'm proud
It's
of you,
to
dude.
get, because
I'm
I
proud
never
of you.
know which clip Alex is going to snip. Normally it's the guest. Sometimes it's me, and I just hear myself sounding like an asshole. So I figure I might as well feed it. But why can't we have peer-reviewed strength and conditioning?
Dude, I 100%. I actually think having, multiple years in fitness, multiple years in coaching, I look at tactical as a unique setting that really should not be following a medical model, should not be following a sports model, should not be following a fitness model. But let me use a sports analogy here. When people say, "Oh, you can't set standards for what a tactical professional or an operator should look like because it could be all these different things on there." And so, I'm lucky enough to work with a lot of guys that are, former military, former high-level military and special operations. And we had to kind of have these conversations over dinner. And they're like, "Well, how do you identify who the best ones are?" I said, "Dude, if I said, hey, you got to go out and do some crazy shit, who are the 5 people you're taking with you?" Okay, let me then start to look at that physiological profile assessment on them. And they're not all going to be the same. But now at least it's like looking, probably not as good. It's like looking at game film and saying, this guy, this woman, this person in this position at this time makes the most sense. And you know what we end up with is we end up with a reverse engineered model of what are the non-failure thresholds for creating a platform of qualities, capabilities, and skills to be successful as a tactical professional. And I don't think anybody in sports is doing that. I kind of think they do it in some medical fields. Clearly, we're not doing it our end, but it's not in my head. I haven't done it. It doesn't seem like it should be that hard, because everything I just laid out, there are statistical and mathematical ways to address those things. And one thing we'll always realize with building a model is a map. It's never the terrain. But if we go back to probability, if I say, hey, I've got 30% chance of being successful going with my gut, and I've got 40% chance of being successful going with my gut plus this mechanical model, which one are you going to use?
Mm-hmm.
I think gears are turning in both of our heads right now on like how to make some of that stuff happen or how to keep that conversation going.
Change the industry.
We have already crossed the hour mark on this one. I appreciate you hanging out a little bit longer. I thought going into this, we were going to spend a bunch of time talking about your whole thing from tactical last year about different purposes of assessments. And we have come to basically the end of the episode, and we won't make this too much longer, but I kind of want to sneak that in here on the back end because it was really useful for me in terms of a way to think about it. I don't know how much of it like you remember and can spit right now, but just like the different like the camera and the crystal ball and the whole like that whole framework for thinking about what you're trying to do with a different kind of assessment.
Yeah, yeah, I absolutely remember it. And I think I even mentioned to you right afterwards, I said, oh, I purposely left
There's a
one
couple
out.
more,
So
yeah.
yeah, if I, when I put up the new graphic, it'll be a camera, it'll be a map, it'll be a crystal ball, and it'll be an engine. And I won't go too far down the rabbit hole, but let's define a few terms on here. Test is to just see when I do a test, I'm trying to see what level you're at. If I do a bench press test, if I do a long jump, if I do anything on there, I just want to know what we call knowledge of results. How far did you throw it? What did you score? Any one of those things. Knowledge of performance is how did you do it? So if you're trying to get up over a wall and you do it in the most inefficient way possible, but you manage to get over the wall, you've passed that test. But you might be at the top of your capacity to deal with something like that. An assessment, on the other hand, is I am measuring and scoring this to identify where you're strong and where you're weak, to then be able to, and I've heard you guys say this on several of your podcasts, be able to take that information and turn it into training recommendations. Those are two very different things. Sometimes tests can be used as assessments. Sometimes assessments can be used as tests. If we're using them both interchangeably, not going to work. Let's throw another one in there. Screen. Screen is just to, and I don't know if you guys have a vibe on FMS or not. I think FMS was one of the most, what's the right word? Was one of the most illuminating things to come into strength and conditioning, just because it's almost that probability thing again. Everybody started saying, oh, you can't predict injury, you can't predict performance. And Gray and Lee were looking at each other like, yeah, I know. Just like I can't use blood pressure to tell you if I got a pulled muscle. Use the right tool in the right spot. But this whole idea of screening of, hey, can I bucket people to quickly try to then dig deeper on there? It's almost like you go into the emergency room and you check your vital signs and use those vital signs as a mechanical algorithm, instead of what do strength coaches love to do is, oh man, I've been doing this forever. I've got an eye. I can just look at somebody, or I can go up and I can ask them a question, or I can look at their log and I can get a bunch of information from them. We call that clinical evidence. And I think I put this in that presentation. I forgot what the stats are, but you get a well-defined mechanical questionnaire that's been validated, and that beats clinical judgment the majority of the time. And here's the easiest way to think of it. Most of the time when we're using clinical judgment, we think there's a bigger value of going from 90%, going from a score of 9 to a score of 10 on a scale from 1 to 10, than there is from going from 2 to 3. Why do we think that? Because psychologically, if we go from 9 to 10, we know that there's certainty in that point. There's 100% that this is there, this is not there. It's just the same distance from going from 9 to 10 to 2 to 3. When we use a mechanical algorithm or a well thought out set of questions or systems check before we go in, that mechanical algorithm does not have the biases or the psychological preference we have. So they look at a jump from 2 to 3 just as important as a jump from 9 to 10. So here are the 4 things. Camera, taking a picture of a moment in time of where you are. That's mostly a test. And there's going to be gray lines on all these things. In statistics, you might just call that descriptives. What's going on? How can I describe what's going on here? The next one that I didn't have on the screen for TSAC was a map. Based on this test or assessment, where are you on this map? Where are you trying to go? What's the best way I can get you there? So we would call that a prescriptive analytic. Based on where you are, where do I want you to go? Crystal ball, predictive. I want to be able to tell the future what's going to happen with a certain amount of probability. So these are now, everybody loves to talk about predictive analytics. And then an engine. How you set up your tests, how you set up your assessment will start to drive the culture of how people are training, because everybody's going to train to the test. I'm getting ready to do a presentation on standing power throw, which I know would be 2 other podcasts if we went down that road. But it was interesting because when I was up working with my buddies and colleagues at BeaverFit, and we did like 10 people. I was capturing some content. who'd never done it. And all I did was send them the link to ACFT, how to do standing power flow. So I got videos, and I said, had everybody come out and do anywhere from 5 to 10 throws just to practice. And they got better on each one. Then I spent 10 minutes coaching them up just with a few little coaching points on there. And really what ends up happening is, one, that's probably going to become a friendly competition over there. And then I started to connect the dots to, hey, you got to make sure you put a jump into it. Hey, when you're going down on that prep swing at the bottom, you're thinking about digging your feet into the ground, because the more force you can get into the ground, the more force you can get on the back of it. Hey, you know what? It should look more like a hinge than a squat. Oh yeah, this kind of looks like a kettlebell swing. Hey, start to play with where you're releasing the ball at the top. So yeah, I don't think anybody's ever going to throw a med ball in their task, or like you guys talked about in combat. But if we can start to connect those dots of, shit, I only threw that damn thing 32 feet, and this person over here threw it 35 feet. I just want to beat their ass. What do I got to do to beat their ass? And let me take a step back in coaching. And a skill like that, sometimes the best coaching advice is what? You want to throw it farther? Motherfucker, just throw it farther and let them find that rhythm till they get there, until they've kind of hit their technique and their physical quality and capabilities peak, and say, oh, okay, let's talk about how to get you stronger, create a little bit more mobility in your shoulders. So it's camera descriptives, it's map prescriptive, it's crystal ball predictive, and it's engine, which is, at the end of the day, really becomes cultural.
Do we need assessments? Are assessments as important as we like to think that they are? Because I hear a lot of folks fighting over what the perfect assessment should look like. Let's include these things. Those things are dumb, blah, 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 blah. But how I see that play out in real time, and you kind of just spoke to this, is like a lot of resources, a lot of time and energy go into assessment day. And then athlete goes away and is in the gym for 6 weeks and then comes back. And then a lot of time and resources go to assessment day part 2. And it's just rinse and repeat, versus what I have found successful for me personally and the athletes that I work with is that you have a lot more of the kind of micro day-to-day assessment type stuff just built into the training to then inform the decision making, to then the program sort of emerges. Emergent periodization is like the word we made up for it. But that, I've had guys that I've trained for years. I've never done an assessment, quote unquote, on them. Like, oh, hey, next Friday is test day. But it seems to work just fine. And maybe I'm being intentionally cynical here, but with assessments, you do create this kind of false atmosphere of performance because everybody's hyped up more than they normally would be. You do end up with people training to the test, which kind of then affects your actual programming. So I'm just wondering, like, you're way more versed on assessments than I am. Are they as big of a deal as we think that they are? Or is there a different way we could be doing things?
Here's how I'll answer that question. Assessments are like a kettlebell.
Got him.
If
Well
you know how
played.
to use a
Well
kettlebell,
played.
it's going to be super helpful. If you use a kettlebell as a doorstop, you don't need a kettlebell. If you're asking me, if I were given the keys to sports science or given keys to DOD, would I have assessments in my program? 100%. But they would have to be executed and used the right way. I think there's something valuable about a game day. I think there should be a game day every week, but I think there should also be playoffs and there should be championships in there. I think there's something to, and you guys tell me because you live in this world more than I do, but I've had a good amount of experience in whether they're new folks coming in, the 17 to 24-year-olds, or folks that have been in for a while. How often are they asked in a physical training sense to go all out at any point in a competitive spirit? I would say understand what you're trying to use the test, assessment, scoring for. If it's strictly for program evaluation readiness, from what I've read, and Alec, we haven't had this conversation, I'd look forward to if you're at TSAC. I think where Space Force is heading makes a lot of sense.
To the moon. They're headed to the moon.
Time series data analysis as you go. I'm interested if they have, I'll get myself in a little trouble here. I'm interested if we have the right people at the table to be able to do that, because it's almost like, hey, we can gather time series data just like we can capture ACFT data. but how are we using it? How are we analyzing it? What are we planning on using it for? How are we feeding it back to the people? I think ACFT information, and you've talked about inability to get raw data. I think that data is going to be super rich down the line, but I think there's also a plan that should be implemented short-term and long-term on how to do these things. Right now, I think ACFT data could definitely be a camera and a map. I don't think it's a crystal ball, and it's definitely an engine. I think with the right folks at the table and this thing being processed the right way, it can absolutely be a crystal ball 2 or 3 years down the line. I would just love to know who's sitting at these tables, because I've been having this same conversation for 10 years. And this might be the last time I use my kettlebell analogy. My kettlebell skills and my statistics skills are about the same. I'm no Pavel, but I'm pretty good, and I can coach the average person on there, but there's people way better at it than me. If I show up into a room where people are making big decisions like we're talking about in DOD and national security and public health and public safety, and I'm having stats conversations that they're not, I'm a little concerned. If I'm the smartest stats guy in that room, which I'm not saying I haven't had a lot of these conversations, that's a cause for concern. And I do think that's the opening for human performance / strength and conditioning. Is, at the end of the day, I'm a gym rat. In fact, in college, my nickname was Willard, which might have been before your time. There was a movie called Willard about a rat. I'm a gym rat who just all of a sudden figured out that math has something to do with being a really mediocre athlete and being able to play on the 8 court at Venice Beach on Saturdays. And that's really what launched this whole career of mine. But that's kind of my suss up of how you guys set that question up.
I don't know if he's listening, but that whole talk about smartest stats guy in the room is just why we need Andrew Thompson to come on the pod as soon as possible. I know he doesn't want to get fired. That's important. I got it. But
Bless him.
I think it'd be cool to have like a little data literacy panel in the mix.
Okay, that's one thing we'll do. Just made a note. You'll help us facilitate.
I'm going to
Data
speak
literacy
something
panel.
into existence here. It's something we've been talking about for a while. It was actually something that Andrew first pushed me on. Is like years ago, there was this like blue ribbon panel where they brought together a bunch of folks to meet and kind of like hash out where DoD was going on a bunch of these issues. And I think we're overdue for some kind of like meeting of the minds, establish a position statement type of conversation. And that's something we would love to help facilitate if we're cool enough to play that role. We'll see. I don't know. With that said, I think we're like more than 20 minutes over on how long we said we'd record for. I want to ask you one more question before we wrap this thing up, is tied to the assessments thing. We talk a lot on here about McNamara's fallacy, which is the idea that only measurable things are important. If it's important, you got to make it measurable. If you can't make it measurable, it must not be important.
Hammond's law tacks onto that.
Yeah, well, Drew decided to create his own addendum. The question I have for you is that as we talk about assessments, we tend to always be talking about things that can be quantified in seconds, inches, pounds, or reps, right? Like easy to count, or we have a device that measures it, and that's it. And I've had a lot of good conversations with a lot of good coaches because it's easy to fall into the trap of assuming those are the only measures that matter. But there's a ton of things that we aren't quite able to consistently measure. And there's work being done on how we can do this with various tools and things that are starting to become available. But like in the military, we never talk about like movement quality or athleticism or things like that. And in fact, I was just talking to somebody about how like if you start coaching elite military populations, you are working with people who can produce really big numbers on the seconds, inches, pounds, or reps type of assessments, but have accumulated a ton of compensations on the road to get there. And because they are just the kind of people who are going to see the assessment or the test set ahead of them and figure out what's necessary to crush that. What are the things from your perspective that we are missing with the DoD being so focused on these easily quantifiable metrics?
Great question.
And I will go back to the TRX level 3 class where you did heavily criticize my air squat technique. I'll put that in there.
I love it. I would say let me talk one about the movement quality one. I think with the technology that's available out there now, literally on your iPhone or your iPad, and we can have a talk. Let me take a step back. Testing assumes measurement. Measurement, good definition for measurement is using an instrument to assign a value along a scale to an object or event. So in each one of those steps, the instrument, the scale, the value, there's major decisions to be made there. Guy named Dr. Joe Stevens, who was my stats and research design professor, used to say, hey, when you're doing a study or you're doing anything on that, there's a universe of events you can look at. There's a universe of ways of what you want to try and get a construct measure of. There's a universe of instruments you can use. There's a universe of scales you can use. There's a universe of ways you're going to measure those things on there. You happen to pick just one and just acknowledge that there's going to be some missing in there. So we know that measurement is never going to be perfect as soon as you get out of these physical qualities like you're talking about. And before I kind of give you the final answer, the other one is the things we say we can't measure. I'm not completely sure that that's true. It's just what's the precision and accuracy of those measurements. Once again, it comes back to probability. How are you feeling today? Do we do a omega wave measurement on you, or do we do a 5-question readiness thing on your iPhone before you get going, or do we have something else on there? Each one of those are getting at this concept of air quotes readiness, and we just have to figure what we're willing to deal with. I would say, given what we have right now, what we're not looking at, which I think could be a simple but not easy solve, is looking at these measures as indices, so let's take movement quality. Let's take overhead squat. I know people hate it, but okay, let's take overhead squat. I can tell a lot from an overhead squat, not just by looking at it, but by actually taking advantage of technology that's available in your pocket these days, and looking not at joint angles, but you can look at things like, okay, where did that movement initiate from? Did I break at the hips first? Did I crack at the knees first? Did I drop into ankle dorsiflexion too soon? What's the timing and sequencing of that squat as I go down? And then what's the absolute magnitude of the joint angles I'm getting? Hey, and what's the relationship between these joint angles? What should my hip flexion be at a certain knee flexion, at an ankle dorsiflexion? And what's my spine angle should be? And if I'm going overhead, what's my elbow extension? What's my shoulder? Like even 5 years ago, people would have said you're crazy. Now we're just like, that's big data, man. We got that set up right now. So now if you take a movement quality test like an overhead squat and you layer that on top of your, keep it simple, 3RM hex bar deadlift, your 2-mile run, standing power throw, all those things, to your point, I can compensate my way around it in terms of my knowledge of results. But if I have a movement quality score, I have a knowledge of performance, you may find, and this is a Gray and Lee thing, an FMS thing that makes total sense from a narrative, but I think this would give us data to support it. Your highest performing athletes may actually be your highest risk athletes because they're working around compensations. Or your highest performing athletes might be leaving performance on the table because there's ways to optimize these things in here. And just because you're seeing a limitation in shoulder mobility, it might not be the shoulder. It might be the big toe. It's probably definitely neck and T-spine in there. But with the power we have on grabbing big data, and when people hear big data, they're thinking N sizes of 10,000. Flip the script. Take one person. There's so many data points we can get on one person. Big data becomes all the levels of information we can get, which we can now crunch like that. I would love to see, and I know a couple of companies, one in particular, that could manage the movement assessment part of it, layering that and coming up with a combined index of all your ACFT scores. I know you guys had a podcast not too long ago where you were like, hey, if we just did the 2 or 3 mile run and the hex bar deadlift, we capture a lot in there. And then Alex, you made a great point of, hey, by having all these events in there, there's now the duration of the event and this total amount of work that goes over the event. So the fact that we're just looking at those individual scores, dude, I can go down this road because this is my favorite road, but I'll stop here shortly, is to your point of how how much of a delta should there be between your 2-mile run time at the end of your ACFT and your best 2-mile run time? I don't know. And what does it mean if it's more in some people and less in some people? I don't know. And is it a bigger difference better, or is less of a difference better? I don't know, but we could really figure all those things out if we put our heads to it. And I would say that's what we're missing in this environment and really across the industry is we're probably not asking the right questions, and we're probably not picking the right measurement tools. And I feel pretty confident saying we're not using the right analytic techniques that address the questions we're really asking, because I don't think anybody's asking how far can you throw a ball, and not only how ready are you, and this will be my last Russian or Soviet point. Their definition of readiness is how ready are you today to take on a training load at a high level that you can recover from and move forward on. Not how hard can you work today, but what's the level of readiness that I can hit that's going to get you right where you want to be. And those are harder questions, but they force us to be better professionals in what we do.
Well, a lot of nuggets in there of value. I know I'm going to hand it to Drew in a second to close. I do want to admit my own skepticism on some of this stuff, though, is I think there are incredible promises being made in the big data machine learning world right now, and some really cool things are happening. I came from the Intel world before I came here, and there are incredible applications for big data there that take processes that were horrible for individual humans to do manually, and we can now feed images into something and it can predict where a boat is going to be X number of weeks from now. Incredible stuff. Really, really cool. And I know work is being done on the N of one, but a ton of data points sample on a specific human and what you can know about them. But like I've been lucky enough to spend some time in a couple of labs that are doing work on that kind of stuff recently. And it seems like the people who are selling the products for application uses now are making promises that are way stronger than the people in the labs developing it as we speak. And that's where my skepticism comes from, is the people in the labs will express a lot of potential and a lot of optimism about the direction it's going and a lot of the progress that's been made in the last 3 to 5 years. But they will hedge what they promise it's capable of in like a live environment or performance environment. And most of the research that's being done is on like rehab and medical applications of these things. And there is a difference between a rehab and medical application and a performance application and a large population application. And I do worry that we might be getting out a little bit ahead of what those tools are ready for.
You 100% agree.
All right, I want to put a bow on something that we brought up. It feels like hours ago, but you mentioned there are a couple of people who you would go to in this industry for like, oh shit moments, Pavel being one of them. I'm curious who your top 3 names are. So
Living or dead, or just living?
They can, well, I'm fine with them being dead.
I'll go
Alex,
living.
are they okay being dead?
Shit, I might shoot. Some of the guys I say might not be around anymore.
Go living, and then let's addendum some dead guys in there.
Pavel's in the mix.
Is he alive? He's alive.
Pavel's alive. I think there's a new book coming out.
He's kicking ass. This guy named Jeff Dillman. Dillman, I think, currently went over to the private sector. I first met Dillman when he was at IMG, but I forget. I think he's been involved with 4 national championship teams, football, strength conditioning coach. I know he was at Alabama, Florida, Appalachian State, and he'll get mad at me because I forgot what the other one was. What I love about Dillman is when I first met him at IMG, we hit it off right away. He's got this infectious optimism. I heard somebody use the term toxic optimism one time, and I love that. And I think that's almost what he is. Little Southern. And so for like, a year or so, we're friends talking on the phone, always asking me these questions like, Chris, you're the smartest guy I know. What about this? What about this? About a year after I'm talking to him, I'm like, dude, you've been gaming me this whole time. You knew all this shit. You were just kind of like testing me. And he kind of laughs. Dude is similar to Pavel in that he doesn't wear his knowledge on his sleeve, and he's a great motivator, great communicator. I go to Dillman for a lot of things that I ask for, and then a guy I haven't talked to in a long time, although I'm pretty sure still around, a guy named Bob Takano, who was an
Oh
Olympic
yeah,
lifting coach.
weightlifting coach. Yeah.
Yeah, and I came across him. I took an extension course in Olympic lifting from him in the early 90s, late 80s at UCLA. And he and I hit it off as well. And I mean, talk about taking a complicated event like Olympic lifting and getting down to some serious simplified things of like, here's 4 or 5 exercises that you're doing all the time. And we're going to teach it from the bottom up. We're not going to teach it from the top down. I'm going to teach you the bump. I'm not going to teach you anything else on there. And I'm going to give you like 2 or 3 accessory exercises. And he taught it as a skill, but he taught it as a skill in such a way that it transferred over to anything on there. And so when I would have conversations about other sports activities, or as I would ask him about how he feels about Olympic lifting being absorbed into CrossFit, uh, he was an iceberg. He had so much more knowledge underneath there than I thought. Now, the other guy I throw in there is a guy named Stuart McGill, the back guy.
Controversial character in some circles.
Oh, big time controversial character.
Well, we've talked about FMS a bunch. That's another controversial one.
Yeah.
Yeah, those guys. The funny thing about the controversial characters, both Stu and Lee and Gray, is they don't look to be controversial. People are walking in with this big old chip on their shoulder saying, hey, you know what? Your thing doesn't do what it says it does. It can't spin straw into gold. And they're like, yeah, I know. We didn't say it did. We're using a hammer to drive a nail. You're trying to use a hammer to start a car. But both those guys, and I would say Stu even more so, and it's interesting because Stu and Gray and Pavel, very tight. I know they were very tight for a long time because I think they come from first principles approaches on those things. Quick story, I know we're running along. So I was trying to recruit Stu to do a research project on TRX straps in his lab because he had the best modeling going out there. I went to visit him up at Waterloo, went in, talked. We hit it off real well. I don't know if you guys have ever heard him talk, if you ever met him. He's a pretty initially stern guy. Like, he made me nervous when I was first talking to him, like I was talking to like a mean uncle or something. So we hit it off really good. I was supposed to go down from there and interview or work with, I forget, George St. Pierre's ex-strength coach. I was supposed to go down and work with him, but Stu and I are working the whole day showing how he's going to run the research. And at the end of the day, he goes, hey, my family and I are going to our lake house. I guess everybody in Canada has a lake house. Family and I are going to a lake house for the weekend. Would you like to join us? And I was like, holy shit. So yeah, so I'm in the car with Stu for like 3 hours driving there. Don't talk anything about science or strength, just hitting it off. We pull up to this pretty amazing cabin made of wood. And I walk in and there's all this fine woodworking, spindles on there. I'm like, holy cow, this is an amazing house. How long you been here? And I forgot how long he's been there. The dude not only built the house, he felled the trees and knew where to go to get them milled to build that house. I walked down into the basement. There's a canoe being carved out of a single piece of wood. The dude is a freak in terms of the Renaissance man. So the controversial science that people think there are there, yeah, let's have that conversation. But man, that just knowing that's the context that the stuff's coming out of his head, I mean, that goes a long way.
Super jealous of Stu McGill's lake house now. So thanks for that.
Well, Chris, this was awesome.
We'll close it here because otherwise we're going to keep talking for hours. We're going to have you back on though. I'm already calling it. Thank you.
No, man, thank you guys. Appreciate the time, and it was a lot of fun. I'm sure there is more stuff we could talk about.
Oh, for sure.
I think this was way overdue. I have been telling you we need to get Chris on for a while. I have text messages going back and forth with Chris. At least like 7 months ago, we were talking about getting him on. I think I was looking at it before we started recording, like how long ago we first like got him on the calendar and got canceled because of travel or whatever. But I'm glad we finally did it.
Well, he strikes me as one of the guests we've had a few that come on, and we bring them on for a particular topic. And sometimes we bring people on for a particular topic and they deliver on that topic. And it's like, great. Like, we check that box. Chris, I think, is one where he came on for a particular topic.
We barely talked about the topic.
Barely talked about the topic, but also opened up so many doors to talk about future topics. And so I would hazard a guess to think that he'll be back probably more than once.
One of the reasons it was overdue is after a lot of our episodes, and I mentioned it when we were talking with him, but like specifically after some Evan PyCon episodes, I'll get an out of the blue text from Chris talking about like definitions of terms or disagreements on the application of something, or always good stuff.
We love disagreements. But no, for me, I think big takeaways. I mean, number one, and I'll say this again, like the peer-reviewed concept in strength and conditioning is very enticing to me. I don't know what that looks like, but I'm curious. And I think Chris has a lot to offer. The other thing, and I mean, this is kind of the reason we brought him on, but was just to talk about assessments.
Mm-hmm.
But the last one for me, the other big takeaway was just the data literacy piece, because I think hopefully I've made this clear enough by now that I think our industry suffers from, sounds really bad, but like we just need to be more intelligent. I think not book smart necessarily, but like, how do we elevate this field of strength and conditioning such that we can sit shoulder to shoulder with medical professionals, providers, whatever, because that's the space that we find ourselves in most of these multidisciplinary teams. And I think Chris, having really straddled both sides of that from a research standpoint and also a practical standpoint, has a lot to offer and offered a lot in this episode, but definitely I think some more strings that we could pull in the future.
I will say it was cool to hear him bring up the difference between tests and assessments, because that was a conversation we just had at work a week ago. I was going back and forth with my team about it. I worry that decision makers in the military conflate the two terms. Or maybe I have just been assuming that the fitness tests the military use should also serve as assessments. And maybe they were never really meant to do that, even though the doctrine says they should be used that way. Maybe they are just tests.
I think people just think tests are assessments.
The Army's doctrine for decades has said that the results of this assessment will guide your future training. But it still has test in the name of the thing, so maybe it is just a test and maybe the doctrine got it wrong. I don't know.
Well, then you got former sergeant majors of the Army just doing ACFT events for PT. So
that's the engine part of the whole
thing.
I don't know. I thought it was great. We definitely circled around a few rabbit holes we could go fully down for an entire episode, and maybe that's what we'll do next time we chat with Chris.
For sure. So yeah, thanks for stopping by, and we will see you next week. Bye. Hey Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in-depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.